So, as leaders, if we're interested in diversity, we really need to be also concerned about the problems that diversity bring, and then how we deal with that. Right? So, I've already talked about how important diversity is in terms of team performance. That when managed properly, when we're intentional about incorporating diversity into our teams, we actually get better performance and better performing teams. But part of that is, as a leader, helping to overcome some of the problems of diversity. Uh, some of the things that come in is things like ignoring or misinterpreting minority input, right? So we talk about minority, although certainly when we think of minority, it immediately brings up the idea of demographic minorities. But if we think about it in terms of the team will have minorities, right? So if we think about demographics, if you have an all if we look at age, if you have a team that's all older people and then just a couple of younger people, right, then they are the minority. And sometimes that input can be ignored. The opposite obviously could also be true if you have a team that's a majority young people and then one or two older people. That again, that minority input can also be ignored. Then the more extreme version of this is even when you get into problems of tokenism, where you have just a single member from a minority group, or the minority is made up of one person. It gets even easier to ignore that person. And actually, what the research has shown, I've actually just seen some research recently that shows that when there's just two people from a particular group in a team or an organization, that the problem becomes even worse than if we have just one person, right? So if a management team includes just two women or just two African Americans, that can actually make the problem even worse than having just one and dealing with the token. Because at least if you have one, everybody kind of steps around and is more conscious and cognizant of what's going on. As soon as you have two, people start to say, "Oh, well, see, we have two women on our board, so we're fine," and they start to go back to that blindness issue. So that can be a problem with minority input. The other problem that can come in is gender and race are often used as a cue for expertise in an irrelevant way, right? So people who have implicit biases, and look, this is, uh, I want to be clear here. I guess I need to talk about this now. A lot of the biases I'm talking about here and we'll be talking about throughout this lecture are often unconscious. It's not about our intentional racism or intentional misogyny. It's about our unconscious biases, which exist, and they exist for all of us. In fact, they exist for all of us, whether we're a white man like myself. Certainly, I have unconscious biases, but as well as other white men, so do women, so do African Americans, so do all minority groups, all people in general. We're going to talk about why that is, but people in general have these biases. What we find in the leadership literature is the classic. I think I've talked about this before in class. The classic idea is think leader, think male, and in fact, think white male. That when we ask people to just imagine a leader, one of the things that comes up tends to be white male. And the inverse of that is when people look at white men, they tend to ascribe them more leadership roles. And so they tend not to look at women in particular in the same way, right? So, and you hear this language every day here at the academy and really across the world, right? When people say, oh, the leader, the squad leader, the company officer, the company commander, we immediately think of a man almost every time. And often we use the pronouns he and his almost every single time. This is a natural thing that occurs. It's a thing that we grow up with. My example from my own life is my second ship. Again, I can't remember if I've told you this story or not, so it's what it is. As a department head, I was on the USS Mustin, and we had a woman captain. And she was the first. She was not the first woman captain of a destroyer, but she was the first to pre-com a destroyer and really to pre-com a ship. And she was outstanding captain. She ultimately made flag and was really great. But one of the things that happened to me is I came home one day from work and I was talking to my family. And at this time, it was my wife and I, and we did have our three kids, but they were very young. They were like, I think our oldest was maybe 5 years old. And I mentioned one time, I remember this very distinctly. I was talking about work. I was talking about the captain. I said, oh, the captain did this, and then she told me this, and she told me this other thing. And I remember my oldest daughter, and again, I have three daughters, and my oldest daughter looks at me and says, Dad, girls can't be captain. And I was just amazed by that because obviously, I hadn't taught them that. I don't stand there and say, I like to think I'm not intentionally misogynistic, and I didn't stand there and say these are, men, rule the world and are captains and women can't be. I was amazed, but if you think about the social influences that we have, what were the models of ship's captains that she had seen as a 4 or 5-year-old? Right? She'd seen Captain Hook maybe, or whatever other examples we have from media, and she had just developed this idea in her brain. Now, for me, the answer in that moment was obvious. The next time I had duty, the family came on board for dinner, and I made sure I talked to the captain about it. I made sure that she came out and met them because I really wanted them to have a good role model of someone and be able to see themselves, but also just to see that a woman absolutely could and did and everything else be in charge of this ship and be an outstanding captain. And I tell this story because I want to again get across this idea that this is an implicit bias that we have and that comes in. And so often we use gender, and race comes in the same way as an irrelevant cue for expertise. And so again, that becomes a problem of, really it's a problem of diversity if it comes in. It goes back to some of that systemic issues I was talking about before. We do tend to see in more diverse teams, we tend to see more conflict. Tend to see less cohesion. Well, I'm going to talk in a few minutes about social identity, but that's really where that comes from. And then the failure to use team resources. People, because of the more conflict, because of the less cohesion, people can be less committed to the team. They don't identify with the team as much if maybe it's a more diverse team that's not part of themselves in the same way, and maybe less motivated to work on behalf of the team. So I want to talk about just psychologically where that comes from and why those things are. So in psychology, we have this idea of social identity theory. And social identity theory rests on a couple of principles. And first is this idea that people classify themselves and others into social categories. And this is an automatic thing that happens. If you remember all the way back, it's probably been a few years for some of you. If you remember all the way back to NL 110 and the idea of system 1 versus system 2 thinking. And the idea of system 1 is our heuristic-based thinking, where we make automatic, subconscious, don't even think about it, judgments. System 2 is when we're more deliberate and we actually go through a cognitive decision-making process that's explicit and upfront. This social classification occurs as a system 1 thing. It happens beneath our consciousness. It's just an automatic thing. Look, it's important. It's an important part of our survival as humans to be able to do this classification. If we had to look at every single person and immediately evaluate them, is this person a part of my team? How can I talk to this person? What are their probably knowledge and skills and activities and everything else? We would be cognitively overloaded from the moment we walked out the door. Instead, our brain makes snap judgments about all the people I see. Are they part of my group? Are they not part of my group? And then what does that distinction tell me about them? So this comes from 2 core social motives that we have as humans. One is to understand the world around us, and one, too, is to understand where we belong in the world. So this understanding, when we classify people in this way, it helps us order our social environment. It's a very systematic, heuristic-based means of defining who everyone is and where they fit. And it also helps us to understand our place in the universe and where we fit in with the rest of the world. So again, this is an automatic function. It takes no controlled cognitive effort whatsoever. And that's partly it's a survival thing, but it's going to happen beneath our consciousness. So we have an automatic process by which we identify people into groups. Now, the next part of this is that we also incorporate this collective into our own identity. So groups to which we belong. And we think about groups to which we belong. I not only demographically, but also functionally in what groups we are. So certainly I belong to the group of men. I belong to the group of white men. I also I'm an officer. I'm an instructor. I'm a senior officer. I'm a dad. All of these different groups to which I belong, I incorporate into my own identity. So certainly being a naval officer is part of my identity as part of the group to which I belong. And so because I belong to this group and because I bring it into my own collective idea of identity, I am more likely to adopt the group norms, right? I don't adopt the group norms of the Brigade of Midshipmen because I'm not a midshipman. That's not part of a group that I'm in. But I do adopt group norms of instructors. I do of the LEL department. I do adopt the group norms of the Navy. I do adopt group norms of my community where I live, etc. Because I identify as part of these groups, and so I'm more likely to pull into their group norms and adopt them as my own. The other thing that happens as we incorporate these groups into our identity is we see the successes and failures of the group as our own. And this will drive our performance, right? So if we want to see groups that we are a part of do well, then we were more likely to work on behalf of the group because we want it to do well. We will also make different attributions based on that identity. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more because this also drives our biases. But what I want you to understand out of this slide is two pieces. One, there's an automatic function by which we identify who's in what group. And then two, once we've identified those groups, and particularly the groups to which we belong, that will drive our identity, which drives our cognitions and also our behaviors. So let me get to the next slide here. This leads to a discussion of in-groups and out-groups. Now, you may have heard of in-group, like when you're in high school, right? There's the in-kids, probably, at least some of you were members of that, right? The popular kids. This is sometimes called the in-crowd or the in-group. When we talk about it from a psychological perspective, when we say in-group, it's just a group that you are a part of. And then the out-group is everyone else, not in my in-group. So for me, white males are part of my in-group. Minority males are part of an out-group. Women are part of an out-group. But that can also change depending on the circumstances. So when I'm teaching in class, our classroom might be an in-group and the class across the hall might be an out-group. When I am meeting with my fellow instructors, being an instructor is my in-group. And then being a student or being part of the administration is out-group to me. So, and those other groupings go away. So when I'm meeting with instructors and being an instructor is part of my in-group, that identity is my in-group, then those demographic differences start to make a lot less difference. And I don't identify women or minorities, demographic minorities who are part of that instructor in-group. I don't identify them as out-group. They are part of that in-group. So the in-groups, so two pieces to get across there. One, our in-group is anybody who is part of our group. An out-group is everybody who's not part of that group. The second is that the salience of the group, which group is important. We're part of many groups. Which group is important can change over time. And that is a key point for us to remember as leaders. Here's the last point here is that even if no formal groups exist, people will implicitly create subgroups. This is something we can't stop from happening, especially as team size grows, there will be subgroups. Now, where those subgroups come from changes depending on our actions. If there are no boundaries, if there's no natural boundaries around functionality or organization or who's on what team or whatever else, and if we don't know people already, those boundaries will initially develop over the things we see, and therefore demographic variables, right? We can immediately see this color of someone's skin. We can usually immediately see what their gender, at least their gender expression is. We can usually immediately see some idea of their age. In the military, we can see rank, we can see community, etc. We will implicitly create these subgroups, and they will develop out of that if nothing else. So you cannot stop subgroups from developing, especially as the teams get larger and larger. Now, what you can do is be intentional about what those subgroups are. So we call the lines between groups fault lines, social fault lines. And the idea is that these social fault lines then split out groups. As leaders, we can be intentional about the strength of these social fault lines. What we really want is for the social fault lines around our team to be stronger than the social fault lines within our team. Therefore, we're creating a group identity, a team identity that's stronger than any subgroup identity within the team. And we want to make sure that those fault lines don't fall across arbitrary differences. So that's why we create them. If we look at even our organization is built around this idea of building these fault lines around important things. On a ship, it's around your division, which is built around your functions. We have a chief's mess, which builds a fault line around being a chief. We have a first class mess, which sometimes does the same thing for first class petty officers. You have the sergeant's group or whatever. That these then become the fault lines that we actually want to create. And as we do this, the arbitrary fault lines will lose their strength. So the key takeaway there is subgroups are going to form, and we as leaders have a role to play in being intentional to see where those subgroups form and where they don't.